So welcome to our next lecture. In this lecture, we're going to take a look at some key concepts that are discussed in Chapter 3 in Top Hat, specifically class inequality, poverty, food insecurity, and homelessness. So our agenda will be to review the definitions and false narrative of choice related to class privilege and classism. Next, we'll look at the different types of poverty, how we define poverty and how we measure poverty, and some forms of food insecurity within Canada. After that, we'll explore issues around homelessness and health and the different types of homelessness. And in the last part of this lecture, we'll do a practice quiz. To begin, let's look at what socioeconomic status actually means. And it is actually defined as a method of ranking people based on wealth, power, and privilege. So people with greater amounts of socioeconomic status within a society have increased income, access to education, more social supports, better health access, more financial security, higher job status, and more positive perception of social class. Those with lower socioeconomic status have less of these same factors. So social class results in a hierarchy that is based on an equal distribution of material resources. And a lot of sociologists use this social class structure of how social structure is organized within Canada, basically in three different groups: the working class, the middle class, and the upper class. And sometimes those are defined and divided into smaller groups. The upper class within Canada constitutes 3% of our overall population. The upper middle class, 10%. The middle class, 23%. The working class, 30%. The working poor, 20%. And the most underprivileged group is 14%. So let's say, for example, you celebrated New Year's, and on January 2nd, when you wake up the day after New Year's, at 10:30 in the morning, Canada's top 100 CEOs in that one day have already earned the average wage of Canadians. And so this begs the questions: are those at the top really worth so much? And are those at the bottom really worth so little? So what is class privilege? We define class privilege as those unearned advantages that result from having a higher socioeconomic status in society. Basically, if you don't have to think about it, it's a form of privilege. So let's look at some examples of privilege using this example from the University of San Francisco. If while growing up, college was an expectation of you and not a lofty dream, then you have class privilege. If you're confident that police exist to protect you, you have white male privilege. If you can use public bathrooms without stares, fear, or anxiety, you have cisgender privilege. If you can expect time off from work to celebrate your religious holidays, then you may have religious privilege. If you can comfortably walk down the street holding your partner's hand, then you have heterosexual privilege. If you don't have to worry about where the elevator is, then you have able-bodied privilege. So let's look at some further examples of class privilege. Ask yourself which of these class privileges apply to you. I have an advanced degree, or I am working on one. My parents have advanced degrees. I have zero to very little debt. I get financial support from parents or relatives. I have a credit card paid for by my parents. I have a safety net of friends and or family to fall back on. I grew up with domestic help. My first job wasn't until after college. My wardrobe has a lot of expensive clothes in it. I have never had an issue affording health care or a doctor's visit. All of these are examples of class privilege. Becoming aware of your privilege, whether it's class privilege or any other form of privilege, should not be viewed as a burden or a source of guilt. It is an opportunity to learn and be responsible so that we can work towards a more just and inclusive world. So let's look first at how we define classism. Classism is prejudice and discrimination based on a person's social class or perceived social class. And it results in individuals who are located at lower positions within the society becoming excluded, devalued, discounted, and marginalized based on that status or position. Remember that classism must be understood with an intersectional approach. I've asked students in class before, give me an example of classism. Here's one student's answer. During an in-class presentation, I would rate a poor person's performance lower than a wealthier person's performance. So we can see that class privilege can lead to classist assumptions and a belief that socioeconomic status and poverty are a choice. We call this the false narrative of choice. In research that I've done, respondents have often talked about the problems with people telling them, because they are poor, what to do. The assumption that simple advice can dramatically change a person's economic outlook assumes that a person's poverty is solely the result of personal failings, rather than the very real and costly systems of oppression, including legacy poverty, systemic racism, student debt, and other causes. One student says, "When I tell someone about my experiences with poverty, I'm met with a cascade of advice on how to do better." Another student says, "If you've never lived in poverty, stop telling the poor people what to do." And another writes, "Despite the myriad systemic reasons that many people live in poverty, there are a handful of tips that well-meaning folks recycle with alarming regularity, like move somewhere cheaper, or buy in bulk, or get rid of your car, or get a roommate, or eat out less." And while all of these may help to mitigate in the immediacy issues around poverty, they are not a means of addressing the systemic causes of poverty. The false narrative of choice is based on what we call the myth of meritocracy. And the myth of meritocracy basically is the belief that people get what they have based on merit. But the wealthiest people in all of the world have largely inherited wealth. They have not earned it themselves. The myth of meritocracy allows those with socioeconomic status privilege to feel good and believe in meritocracy and individual action. It allows those with this privilege to ignore the systems that privilege and oppress, rather than confront and dismantle them. By that we mean it's much easier to blame people as the victims of their own circumstances than to look at society and look at the systemic reasons that are causing poverty. In Activity 1 of Top Hat, your reflection in this chapter is based on a game that you will play called Make the Month. And in it you will be given a number of scenarios that you have to work through and try and end up not in poverty at the end of the game. The story that you'll read in the activity, In Their Shoes, is a story of a young woman who writes to a public authority, and the essence of the story is talking about the detrimental effects of labeling those who are poor, how that leads to stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination. So it's important we look at using an anti-oppression framework, that we look at the structural causes of poverty first, that we reject the false narrative of choice as your starting point, and that you use your privilege as an opportunity to work towards a more just and equitable world, rather than a vehicle for advice. And a wonderful example of this is the video within Top Hat chapter number 3, which is a TED Talks by Dr. Naheed Dessani. Dr. Dessani is a physician working in the city of Toronto, providing palliative care to those who are homeless on the streets of Toronto. Canadians believe that poverty is an important issue. They care about poverty. You can see in a ranking of issues there that unemployment and jobs is considered by almost 50% of Canadians to be the most important issue, and that is closely related to the issues of poverty and social inequality. As are issues of health care, because as you know, poverty is a social determinant of health, and it is a vicious cycle. Ill health leads to poverty, and poverty leads to ill health. One of the greatest myths is that people living in poverty in Canada are not employed, and that is not true. In fact, most adults living in poverty in Canada are employed. While the depth of poverty is primarily a story of inadequate social assistance, the real story of poverty is about low wages. Most of the poor in Canada are not on social assistance. Most of those who are poor in Canada are working, but they're struggling with low-wage, low-paying jobs. It's also important to remember that poverty is not random. 1 in 7 people in Canada live in poverty, and that is about 13.9% or 4.8 million people living within Canada. But if you are a member of any of these particular groups, your chances of living in poverty substantially increase. So while the overall rate of poverty is 13.9%, the rate of poverty for children living in sole support families is almost 50%. It's 43.4%. 23% of people with disabilities will live in poverty. 24% of Indigenous people in Canada live in poverty. That's about a quarter of the Indigenous population. 31.4% of new immigrants and refugees live in poverty. And 32.4% of sole support families live in poverty. So poverty is not random. Your chances of living in poverty are greater if you're a member of any one of those particular groups. While people often have the perception that Canada is an extremely wealthy country, there are many Canadians who struggle with issues of food and water insecurity, particularly in northern Canada. The annual family income for Inuit in northern Canada is less than $17,000 a year. So imagine if that was your annual family income, and yet these are the food prices that you had to pay. $28 for a head of lettuce, $104 for 24 bottles of water, $10 and $16 for peppers, $12 for a bag of cookies, $8 for cauliflower, $32 for a few chicken burgers, or $37 for some chicken breasts, $14 for a box of juice, $62 for prepared chicken, $35 for pogo sticks, $82 for 12 cans of ginger ale. Most disturbing is $55 for infant formula. That is very hard for mothers with who are unable to breastfeed to be able to afford that when their annual income is $17,000 a year. A box of laundry soap, almost $50. So you can see by those prices that many portions of Canada, particularly in northern Canada, struggle very much with issues of food insecurity. We don't have an official definition of what poverty is in Canada, but we do use 3 measures of poverty to define it. The first measure that we're going to talk about is called LICO, and that's an acronym that stands for Low Income Cutoff. You'll also read in your chapter about LIM and MBM, standing for Low Income Measures and Market Basket Measures, which are other means of measuring poverty. Let's look at the LICO cutoff line. This is a poverty line that's been established by Statistics Canada, where basically it looks at the majority of your basic needs, that is 63%, are or more, are used on basic needs, such as food, shelter, and clothing. So you can see in the orange line across the top, this is the low income cutoff after taxes based on 2019 income in Canada. And the community sizes are listed there from rural in a range up to those communities with a population of $500,000 or greater. And then you need to cross-reference that with family size, which are the blue columns running down on the left side, running from family sizes of 1 single person to families of 7 persons or more. So let's say, for example, you are a family of 4 persons living in the city of Toronto, which has a population over 500,000. So go to the column on the right for communities with a population of greater than 500,000 and scroll down to the family size of 4 persons. There you can see the amount of $41,406. That is considered the poverty line. Families making below that, so if you were to make, for example, $40,000 a year with 4 persons living in the city of Toronto, then you would be considered living below the poverty line. If you made more than that, let's say, for example, you made $45,000 with the same demographics, then you would be living above the poverty line. Next, let's take a look at some of the different types of poverty. We're going to take a look at transitional poverty, marginal poverty, intergenerational poverty, relative poverty, and absolute poverty. So transitional poverty is a temporary state of poverty that occurs when someone loses a job for a short time. This often happens when people get laid off from work, or maybe they go on strike, as examples. The next form of poverty is called marginal poverty, and that's a state of poverty that occurs when a person lacks stable employment. That means a person has precarious work or is underemployed. So if you're working in a company or a business where your work is casual, contract, no benefits, temporary, minimum wage, or if, for example, you work in the seasonal industry where you only work for certain periods of time throughout the year, those are all examples of marginal poverty. Intergenerational poverty is generations in a family who experience chronic and cyclical poverty. So that means grandparents are poor, parents are poor, and children are poor. And that poverty continues throughout the cycle of those generations. The next form of poverty is called relative poverty, and that's a state of poverty that occurs when we compare ourselves to those around us. So if we look around us and our life choices and opportunities are more restricted than those that are around us, then we may be experiencing what's called relative poverty. Here's an example. In some research that was done with grade 4 and 5 students in North Bay, Ontario, they're asked to explain what poverty means to them. And here's what they respond. Poverty is not being able to go to McDonald's, getting a basket from the Santa Fund, feeling ashamed when their dad can't get a job, not buying books at the book fair, not getting to go to birthday parties because they couldn't afford a birthday present, hearing their mom cry, wishing they had a nice house to invite friends over to, not being able to have their friends for a sleepover, hearing their mom and dad fight about money, not being able to go camping, not getting a hot dog on hot dog day at school, not getting pizza on pizza day at school, pretending you forgot your lunch, not playing hockey, not being able to go to clubs, not being able to play soccer, not being able to take swimming lessons, not having barrettes for my hair, not having my own backyard to play in, being teased for the way I dress, not getting to go on school trips, and not having breakfast sometimes. And so while none of those examples are examples of absolute poverty, they are examples that limit choice, and they can be painful. And the final form of poverty is called absolute poverty, and that is a state of poverty where a person is so poor that they lack the resources to survive. In these examples, these are homeless people who are experiencing homelessness, who are living on the streets. Homelessness is a social category that includes anyone who cannot obtain and sustain long-term, adequate, and risk-free shelter. Homelessness is a social determinant that can influence your health. We know that housing is a basic human right and requirement for good health. Adequate, suitable, and affordable housing contributes to our physical and mental well-being. It leads to increased personal safety and helps decrease stress, leading to improved sleep and diet. All of these factors result in better mental health outcomes. When housing is inadequate or unavailable, personal as well as community well-being can suffer. A homeless person is 4 times more likely to die of cancer, is 5 times more likely to have heart disease, and is 28 times more likely to have hepatitis C. The life expectancy for an average Canadian is between 77 and 82 years of age, but the life expectancy for those who are homeless is only 34 to 47 years of age. In a recent study looking at homelessness and COVID-19, it was found that while the homeless were more likely to be tested, they were also more likely to have positive test results. Persons who were homeless were 20 times more likely to be admitted to hospital for COVID-19. They were 10 times more likely to require intensive care and 5 times more likely to die within 21 days of their first positive test result. There are different forms of homelessness. Absolute homelessness is a situation where people either live in emergency shelters or they live on the street. Hidden homelessness, or sometimes referred to as concealed homelessness, refers to people without a place of their own. They may live in their car, they may live with family or friends, or they may live in a long-term institution such as a prison. When we look at how many people are homeless in Canada, we use a measurement referred to as point-in-time count, or what's called PIT count. It's a national strategy to gather data every 2 years on the number of people who are homeless in Canada. The PIT count provides a snapshot of homelessness at a given time with the purpose of helping to better understand who's homeless and what their needs are. So community agencies go out and count and survey those in the community who are experiencing either absolute homelessness, means those who are living outside or in temporary shelters, and it also counts those experiencing hidden homelessness, those who are staying with other people, or couch surfing, or living within institutions. So community agency workers go out to many different types of institutions. They also look at streets, parks, public locations, transit stations, abandoned buildings, and many other forms of outdoor locations. So let's take a look at what the pit count in the Niagara region is. So in 2018, which is the last time when a pit count was done, there were 408 surveys that were completed. And in that survey, it was found where people were staying that night. And you can see overwhelmingly people were staying in emergency shelters or safe beds, or a form of transitional housing. The reasons for experiencing housing loss based on that survey was, first of all, family breakdown, including conflict or violence. Second, being financial or job loss. Third, being addiction or substance use. Fourth, being unsafe housing conditions. And fifth, being illness or medical conditions. So respondents self-identified their homelessness being linked to some of these issues. So mental health, as you can see, over 50% of the respondents indicated that they had a mental health issue. Almost 30% indicated they had an addiction or substance use issue. Almost 30% were experiencing a serious or ongoing medical condition. Almost 20% had a physical disability, or 20% had a learning disability. And so we can see there are many different reasons, but many of them are tied to health. You can also see from the pit count the systems that persons who are experiencing homelessness had interaction with. And you could see that the majority of people actually had interactions with the ER or had spent days in the hospital. And to a lesser extent, those had interactions with the police or the criminal justice system. So it's likely those working in healthcare are going to have a large interaction with persons experiencing homelessness. When we look at issues of psychiatric homelessness, the Canadian Mental Health Association has found that people with lived experience of mental health and addictions conditions are disproportionately affected by homelessness. And it is really hard to measure homelessness, so their estimate is a very wide range, but it is between 25 and 50% of all people who are homeless in Canada are believed to be living with a mental health condition. Consequences of homelessness also tend to be more severe when coupled with a mental health condition, meaning that people remain homeless for longer periods of time, they have less contact with family and friends, they have more barriers to employment, and they have poorer health than other homeless people. The last form of homelessness is called relative homelessness, and that is individuals who have housing. So you can technically be considered homeless even when you have housing, but if your housing is considered to be substandard, undesirable, or if you're at risk of losing your home, then you are considered to be experiencing relative homelessness. And this includes instances of domestic violence. So now I'd like you to take out a pen and a piece of paper, and we're going to do a little practice quiz. I want you to write down number 1, and you don't need to write the question out. Just put number 1 on your piece of paper and see if you can guess what the answer is. Kareem was laid off from his job. He struggled financially for 6 months until he found another full-time job. As a result, Kareem had to sell his house and rent a small apartment. What type of poverty did Kareem experience? A. Absolute poverty. B. Transitional poverty. C. Intergenerational poverty. Or D. Cultural poverty. So on your sheet of paper, you should have question number 1, and then choose which answer, using the letter that's provided there, for your response. Question number 2. You are watching a telethon on television after an earthquake has hit Haiti. Sponsors are asking viewers to call in and make donations to feed children who do not have enough food to survive. What are these children experiencing? A. Relative poverty, B. Transitional poverty, C. Absolute poverty, or D. Cultural poverty. Question number 3. When a teacher asked a grade 4 and 5 group of students in North Bay, Ontario, what poverty meant to them, some of the children said not being able to go to McDonald's, not having pretty barrettes for their hair, and not being able to have their friends sleep over. What are these experiences examples of? A. Relative poverty, B. Marginal poverty, C. Absolute poverty, or D. Cultural poverty. Question number 4. Malcolm was born into a poor family. Both his parents were also born into poor families. Even more, Malcolm's grandparents were also born into poor families. This reflects A. Intergenerational poverty, B. Absolute poverty, C. Transitional poverty, or D. Marginal poverty. Question number 5. David and Susie have a 7-month-old daughter. Dave lost his job recently, and then they lost their house and moved into Susie's parents' home. They are both looking for employment so they can eventually afford a place of their own again. Which type of homelessness, and remember now, we're not talking about poverty, we're talking about which type of homelessness are Dave, Susie, and their baby experiencing? A. Hidden or concealed homelessness, B. Absolute homelessness, C. Relative homelessness, or D. Forced homelessness. Question number 6. Maria lives with her husband and 3 children. Her husband is abusive towards her. She thinks about leaving him, but does not know where she would go or how she would be able to get the children away from him. Which type of homelessness is this an example of? A. Absolute, B. Relative, C. Forced, or D. Hidden or concealed homelessness. Question number 7. Based on the 2019 Statistics Canada data, a family of 5 people living in the city of Welland, with a population over 50,000, with a family income of $36,567 after tax, is living above Canada's LICO line. So we're looking at a family of 5 persons living in a community with a population of 50,000. So 5 persons living in a community of 50,000. So you can see there the LICO line is 39,378. So if that family is making 36,000 after taxes, is it true or false that they are living above the LICO line? Question number 8. Poverty in Canada is randomly distributed, with each person having about the same chance of ending up poor. Is the answer A, true, or B, false? Question number 9. Most adults living in poverty in Canada are employed. A, true, or B, false? And the last question. Children, recent immigrants, Indigenous peoples, and people with disabilities are more likely than others to live in poverty. Is that A, true, or B, false? So check your answers now and see how you did.